the Caledonian Elixir. Welcome to the Caledonian Elixir. This is a podcast that takes a tragic deep dive into the darkest recesses of the human condition. I'm your host Vincent, and today on the Elixir I'm going to break down and discuss the most brain-bending cult that I think ever existed. A cult that incidentally caused the largest mass suicide in history. The name of this cult is the People's Temple. The origin of the People's Temple can be traced back to Jim Jones. Jones was born on May 1931 to unremarkable normal parents. At the age of 15, a young Jones began preaching on the sidewalks of Richmond. After high school, he attended work as an orderly in Reed Memorial Mental Hospital, where he met his soon-to-be wife Marceline. Jones also worked as a night watchman and attended university, but it was in 1952 that Jones found his calling as a minister for Somerset Methodist Church. Jones preached the gospel to both the white and black community. His gospel of racial tolerance and charisma soon caused him to gain a following, and with a frantic, frenzied schedule that would eventually include radio programming, Jones became a rising star with the black community and church organisations. However, Jim Jones went through something of a conversion himself when, in returning from a sojourn in Brazil and Cuba, he began preaching revolution and socialism. There is no consensus on what changed Jones's views, but the change was evident in his theology. He now mixed radical politics with a form of Christian revivalism, preaching in robes and aviator sunglasses, regaling his ministry for hours about the evils of capitalism. In other words, his church became a temple with the mystique of a religion, but rather than preach the gospel of Christ, he read the Red Book by Mao. The People's Temple, which the church became known as, began investing in the community. Up to as many as 3 convalescent homes for children were built, and even a pet shelter. In 1972, they relocated to San Francisco and became involved in a local healthcare outreach program. As a result, many more disadvantaged children, individuals, families gravitated to the temple, predominantly from black communities. However, in spite of the good community work the temple was involved with, the psychodrama inside the church became extremely bent and degrading, especially in the dealings with its members. More and more temple members were encouraged to sign over their life savings to Jim Jones. Public humiliation and beatings were bestowed out to any member that showed dissent. Jones constantly took advantage of his female followers, regaling them with his insatiable need for sex while ridiculing their partners, the men. In addition, the Planning Commission, which was the inner court of the temple, was deciding the social and sexual lives of the congregation. Families were being torn apart, couples separated, children taken from parents and given to other temple members. The People's Temple was acquiring a small fortune, in part due to the vast amounts of wealth handed over by temple members. Much of this income was in turn used by Jones to purchase thousands of acres of land in the South American state of Guyana. You see, Jones was very paranoid over nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the West, and this part was his reasoning why he bought land in South America. To add to this, Jones was making more inroads into local politics. When in the mid-70s, he was appointed to the San Francisco Human Rights Commission and even shared a table with the then President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, at the Democratic National Convention. However, the 1960s and 70s was the era of COINTELPRO, and due to the temple being a magnet for a black community preaching boisterous support for the socialist ideas, suspicion became rife over the FBI and CIA. So when stories by temple defectors began leaking to the media, fear of a harsh government response into the temple was becoming too real. This was only made worse when local politicians began discussing the brainwashing and beatings in the cult, with Senator Leo Ryan launching his own investigation into People's Temple. Leo Ryan is an important figure in the Jonestown tragedy. He was a congressman from California and very critical of the CIA, more specifically the covert MKUltra program. He pushed back against the CIA's covert mind control projects by co-authoring an amendment in Congress that called for CIA covert disclosure. To add to this, Ryan's friend's son, Bob Houston, who joined the People's Temple, was murdered when trying to flee the temple just 2 days after he exited the cult. As a result, Ryan was in an intricate web of cult's conspiracy that involved the CIA and left him, incidentally, with many enemies. However, back in San Francisco, new charges against the People's Temple began surfacing in the press, and with New West magazine releasing an expose of People's Temple, Jones began to panic. So in the summer of '77, 900 members of the People's Temple, including Jim Jones, relocated from California to the remote jungle of Guyana. In the jungle of Guyana, People's Temple worked in grueling conditions to create the commune they named Jonestown. It was an accomplishment. Think about it. Californian city dwellers now deep in a South American jungle, working, building, housing farms, exposed to the elements, animals, insects of the jungle. Often temple members worked night and day, provided with only a morsel of food. In a sense, it was concentration camp living. All they now had was each other, alone, isolated in the jungle, as Jim Jones became more unstable. Deborah Layton, who was eager to travel to Guyana to live in Jonestown, stated, "I was sent to work in the fields for 6 weeks. It was grueling. There were venomous snakes. I had sunstroke and was dehydrated. All I had to live on was rice and beans." By 1977, Jones was completely dependent on drugs. He used barbiturates at night to sleep and amphetamines during the day. The Jonestown pharmacy was replete with a cornucopia of drugs, including many types of hallucinogenics, such as LSD and DMT. Conditions got so bad that loudspeakers were set up all over the settlement. They would go on day and night, with Jones regaling inhabitants with fabricated news reports of genocide and race war occurring back in the United States. As the people of Jonestown had no access to the outside world, and most members being black, the accounts of race war and genocide stoked only more fear into their hearts and reinforced their belief in Jim Jones. Back in the States, however, concern over what was taking place in Jonestown was growing. To add to that, the prospect of a cult of around 1,000 Americans with potential ties to the Soviet Union existing independently in the jungle of Guyana was becoming an embarrassment for the United States government. So in November of 1978, Leo Ryan travelled with a small delegation to Guyana. The congressman was initially held up in the capital, Georgetown, with Jones attempting to prevent the delegation arriving. Regardless of Jones' protests, however, Ryan's delegation arrived at Port Kaituma, which was the only airstrip near Jonestown. Then they were transported to the settlement. Jones's paranoia about FBI and CIA infiltrators was shared among the other senior temple members. With Ryan arriving, a sense of dread descended. Sinister forces were at work. The inhabitants of Jonestown, only half aware of what it all meant, now wallowed, waiting in fear. The delegation was in Jonestown for just 2 days and were treated to a concert by temple members. However, the atmosphere changed when several members approached Ryan wanting to defect. The congressman's stay came to a dismal end when he was attacked, so transportation was arranged. Then Ryan and all those wanting to leave Jonestown were taken by truck through the jungle back to Port Kaituma. However, among the defectors was a man named Larry Layton, and Layton had no real intention to defect. Instead, he was given a gun and was on a mission to kill Leo Ryan. As the congressman and the group with him was being transported to the airstrip, Jim Jones could be heard on the speakers calling for everyone in the settlement to gather in the pavilion. Jones then subjected the congregation to one last manipulative diatribe. He explained that the congressman would be killed and the plane downed. Incidentally, at Port Kaituma, Larry Layton pulled a gun out as the plane was taking off and began firing at as many people as possible. The congressman and defectors tried to flee, but were then ambushed by an armed group of temple members arriving by truck. At some point, the news of Leo Ryan's assassination got back to Jones. An understanding of the gravity of assassinating a United States Senator, Jones explained to the community there was no escape for them now. They had to act before they were all killed by the United States government. I haven't met a single man who will not die, so at some point hope runs out for all of us. This is Jones' response to a woman who pleads not to die in the pavilion that day, as what transpires next is beyond tragic. Jones convinces some, then force the rest of the congregation to commit suicide. Vats of cyanide prepared and mixed with Kool-Aid. It started by Jim Jones telling mothers to kill their children by giving them cyanide-laced juice. Then after all the children lay dead, it was time for the adults to take their own lives. For those who refused were met by Jim Jones' guards in a syringe filled with cyanide, and when they were forcibly injected, all they could do was find a spot to die. Surrounded by armed guards, the entire community of over 900 souls perished, and Jim Jones committed suicide shortly after. The Jonestown mass suicide took place on November 18, 1978, and in spite of the massive media attention, the case hasn't been completely explained. In fact, there are those who claim that Jonestown was in fact a CIA medical mind control experiment. Therefore, to explain this theory, it is important to spotlight a few of the sinister, strange persons involved in People's Temple. Dan Matrioni is one such person. Matrioni had a close association with Jim Jones as far back as Jones' teenage years in the state of Indiana, where Matrioni was a police officer. Later, he and Jones were both in Brazil at the same time. It was known that Matrioni became a CIA officer with AID cover, that is, the Agency for International Development, and was involved in the training of Latin American police forces in the use of torture. Moreover, Matrioni was an associate with John Gittinger, a resident genius in the CIA MKUltra program, who worked on projects from Midnight Climax to the Personality Assessment System. Therefore, there is a link with Jim Jones and even the scientists involved in MKUltra. But the connections between the People's Temple and the CIA don't end there. Now we turn to Richard Dwyer. Dwyer had a background in intelligence. He was a career intelligence officer for the CIA, working for the State Department at the US Embassy in Georgetown. Dwyer was present at Port Kaituma airstrip during the killing of Senator Ryan. In addition, he was also present in Jonestown just prior to the mass suicide. To add to this, an interesting anomaly is that the CIA knew of the tragedy of the suicide at Jonestown before anyone else. They knew at 4:44 AM, yet the site hadn't been visited by Guyanese troops until around 10 AM. So again, how did the CIA know before anyone else of the tragedy at Jonestown? Well, the most obvious answer is Richard Dwyer. If Dwyer was present in Jonestown during the recording of the death tape, he would have relayed that information back to the CIA. Moreover, a clue to a larger conspiracy involving the CIA is evidenced by a memorandum that refers to a CIA field station in Guyana outside of the capital Georgetown. Many have speculated that this field station was in fact Jonestown. Indeed, even the children of Senator Leo Ryan brought a lawsuit against the United States government. They claimed Jonestown itself was a CIA mind control experiment and that their father Leo Ryan should have been informed before he left. And then, not forgetting, there is the Layton family. I have mentioned earlier Larry Layton, one of the assassins at Port Kaituma. However, his father Lawrence Layton was the chief of the US Chemical Warfare Division, and his brother-in-law was a Temple member, Philip Blakely, and him being an FBI agent. So when you look closely at the People's Temple, you see connections to the CIA, FBI, US chemical warfare industry, the Democratic Party. There is no other way to address the not-so-separate strands to institutions of power other than a force driving it towards a particular direction. Look, the amount of drugs found in Jonestown was far in excess of what thousands of inmates of a settlement would require. With involvement of Dr. Lawrence Layton, former head of the US Chemical Warfare Division, gives credence that Jonestown was some kind of experiment gone awry. But there is no warm gun found at Jonestown. In truth, we are left exploring mysterious synchronicities awash in conspiracy. Maybe it is something demonic and invisible at the heart of the People's Temple. And as they stand in the compound, the jungle night darkened, the sound of gunfire chilling them. Suddenly, like some satanic orchestra, the helpless who realise that they are breathing their last moments on earth, unspeakable fear mingling with the tears and screams of mothers poisoning children, husbands embracing their wives for the last time in horror and in desperate love, all hope dying within their hearts as one by one they fall, never to hope or pray again. So I will leave you with a simple message, one you've probably heard before, but it hanged from the pavilion ceiling just above where Jim Jones sat that day, and it read, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Well, that is the end of the People's Temple. Not a very happy story or ending, but I hope you enjoyed and learned something. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll catch you later.